Wow, it's not Hell's Kitchen video. I don't think a single franchise has had a bigger impact on my life than The Walking Dead. The post-apocalyptic zombie series known for its heartbreaking moments and sheer brutality, and since The Walking Dead TV series recently finished up its final season, I thought it'd be fitting to make a great send-off by ranking every episode of the Telltale series. Yeah, out of all the Walking Dead media, the Telltale games is the media I'm the most familiar with, and for good reason. It's how I got introduced to the Walking Dead universe, and it perfectly encapsulates what the Walking Dead is all about. I recently decided to replay the games that are the 10-year anniversary of the first season finale, and needless to say, I still love them. The characters are iconic, the choices are impactful, the sad moments are super sad, and it's still one of, if not my favorite game series of all time. Despite this, replaying the game made me look at it a lot of the episodes in a brand new light, since I have taken off the rose-colored glasses and now I have more developed opinions. Some of these episodes might be better on replay, worse on replay, or just about the same as I remember. So yeah, I'm gonna rank them. But how am I going to rank them exactly? Since there's 5 seasons, including the Michonne series, what I'll do is rank each episode per season. Seasons 2 and 3 have 5 episodes, Season 1 has 6 technically, Season 4 has 4, and the Michonne series has 3. I'll be starting from Season 1 and ranking each of their episodes by itself. Once that's done, I'll repeat the process for the other seasons, and at the end, I'll do a final ranking for every episode of the series. Got it? Let's go! A New Day is a pretty great start to the game. It pretty much sets up everything you need to know about The Walking Dead and what the player will be doing without overwhelming them. This episode does a good job introducing iconic characters such as Lee, Clementine, Kenny, Carly, and they even throw in Herschel and Glenn from the comics, which I always appreciate because I always enjoy that connection between other media, and the fact that both of them play a role in the plot really helps because it shows they're not just there for fan service. The plot is also really tight knit here. You are Lee Everett, a convict who manages to fall into becoming the protector for a little girl named Clementine. Along the way, you encounter many survivors, some of whom will start on your side and others not, with your choices affecting what others think of you and who lives to see another day. I should also talk about the choice mechanic here, since I think it's one of the stronger episodes when it comes to that. And I know the obvious choice for that is the Carly and Doug choice, which, let's be honest, is Telltale's most iconic choice. But the other choices aren't anything to scoff at. The choices of Irene or Silent Survivor Kenny or Larry, I think are great ways to establish what type of character you want Lee to be. A truly heroic character or an absolute scumbag. Also, I don't know when I'll be able to mention this again, but one of my favorite parts of this entire season is just the look of it. I think it captures that early Walking Dead apocalypse vibe perfectly by visuals alone, and this episode in particular really shows it. Especially in the first shot of Lee and Clementine's backyard, it looks very normal, but the shot looks so lonely and foreboding, and I just think that's amazing. If there's only 2 complaints I have to make, is that I think the drugstore segment goes on for a bit too long, although I think the puzzle is pretty good. And his other one is more of a nitpick, but I kinda wish they saved the more decayed walkers until, say, episode 2. I know there was probably a budget, and there's no point in making a lot of character models that will only be used for one episode and never again, but one of my favorite moments in the TV show is that the walkers still looked a lot like humans, but there was a sort of uncanniness about them. It's just really great horror. Regardless, those 2 points don't attract all that much from a pretty great opening episode. So the first episode I sort of see as a tutorial level as source before the game really starts to throw bigger challenges at you, and I think Start for Help is the perfect follow-up. Start for Help's biggest strength is without a doubt its horror. I know The Walking Dead is usually horror, but more often than not, its horror usually comes from the walkers, and while the first few walkers will probably be scary to some, the scare does eventually wear off. Not with this episode. This is going to sound weird, but I think a lot of people tend to sleep on this episode when it comes to its horror. The opening scene itself is just pure nightmare fuel. The St. John family, as much as some people say they're stereotypical, I think they're the perfect antagonists for this episode. Hell, some of my favorite moments from this game involve them, like the entire dinner scene. One moment in particular I'll always remember is if you manage to unscrew the keypad on the barn door and you see all the gore behind it, and Annie comes by and says,
"Boy, didn't you hear the bell? Dinner time."
with that tone of voice and all that gore, one would immediately think they're psychopaths, but Angie comes up with a perfectly logical explanation. In fact, I think that's another thing I like about this episode when it comes to the choice mechanic. Pretty much everyone is logical in some way. Hell, even Larry. Speaking of which, the choice with Larry is honestly one I think is super slept on when it comes to the best choices in the game. Larry has his heart attack and you can either kill him or try reviving him. Personally, this choice is handled perfectly, and even though he dies regardless, the way he dies is super brutal. This episode also does a great job of developing Lee into become the true leader of the group, where Kenny and Lily both have good points, but they have severe flaws that don't make him ideal to lead. The fight against the St. John's proves this. Something I also noticed on replay that I somehow managed to completely not catch earlier was that the entire episode was centered around food. The beginning of the episode has Mark and Lee talk about the lack of food. Lee has to give out food to 4 people. The St. John's lure the group to the dairy and promises of food. The bands in the woods want food. The St. John's want to use the group as food. And the end of the episode has the group steal a station wagon full of food. It's a simple theme, but this episode does a lot with it, which really shows how strong this episode is overall. I think the only problem with the episode is that apparently the bear trap in the woods belonged to the St. John's. I think it could have been a bit more clear that there was a connection. Like, maybe there's an interactive that gives you the chance to look at it when you're out of the meat locker. Regardless, it doesn't detract from an episode that I honestly think is better than A New Day. Yeah, it's at the top of the list right now. Only question is, can it be topped? Something I actually noticed that the early episodes each have is a big strong suit. A New Day's strong suit is that it eases players into the universe of The Walking Dead. Star for Help's biggest strong suit is the horror evolve, and Long Row Ahead's strong suit is the character development. I think the episode starts out really strong with Kenny and Lee discussing abandoning the motor inn in light of the St. John incident, and then Chris problems with staying there. The choice of the girl in the street I think is pretty strong, even though I do think it comes a bit out of nowhere. Actually, I think the first 75% of the episode is strong in general. You have the motor inn mystery to keep things from getting too boring, and the band fight is fun, as well as the aftermath of literally killing Doug or Carly. After that comes the impending death of Doug, which is really well handled, and the death scene itself is without doubt one of the most heartbreaking in the game's history. Then we have teaching Clementine, which is one of the most important bits of the game. It's handled super well, and it's a great way to show the effect Lee has on her. Going back to the character development bit, this episode's biggest strength is that it develops the characters around Lee. Lily finally snaps and kills a companion, Kane loses his wife and son and goes for a big personality change, Doug feels like he isn't helping enough, Carly strengthens her bond with Lee and tells him to admit his past to the group, Ben starts his downward spiral of many bad choices, and even Katja gets a bit of development before her death. However, I don't think the episode is as good as Star for Help or even A New Day. I think a part of that comes down to the other 25% of the episode where you're trying to take down the tanker on the bridge. I know its point is to primarily have Lee and Clementine bond and to introduce Kristen and Omi, but I feel like this part of the episode feels like padding to an extent. Like, the game could have easily introduced Kristen and Omid somewhere else in the game, and there are other areas you could have had Lee and Clementine have their first solo expedition together. I did also feel that the choices kind of took a step down a bit. I did mention the girl in the street that, while I like the point of the choice, it does come out of nowhere, and some of the other choices in this episode I never really felt challenged me. I felt more than comfortable leaving Lily behind. I was more than ready to put down Duck for Kenny. Helping Omid was easy because he was injured. They're not bad choices per se, but I feel they could have been better. Also, while I mentioned I did like the bandit fight itself, I kinda wish the bands ended up being more of a threat than they actually wound up being. Like, it's awesome seeing Lee take out all these bands by himself, but I wish they were built up as a more credible threat. Right now it's at the bottom of the list, but I highly doubt it's staying there for long, because despite my misgivings, I still think it's a good episode, just not on the level of Star for Help or A New Day. Wait. Before I go into this, I should mention a running theme of these games. More often than not, the fourth episode of these seasons will usually be considered the weakest. And considering we're on the fourth episode now, well, let's see. Something I'm immediately going to point out that I love is the whole environment of Savannah. The foggy atmosphere is just so eerie and foreboding. It's almost like something out of Silent Hill. Speaking of which, this whole episode feels like something out of Silent Hill. What do I mean by that? Well, much like Star for Help, around every corner has a big horror vibe to it. Unlike Star for Help, however, where the episode's horror was mainly gore with some foreshadowing, this episode's horror is more atmospheric. Again, I have to mention the town itself. It's so much like Silent Hill. And the imagery shown wouldn't be out of place, such as the dog you have to dig up, the walker barricade, and even some of the themes involved with the characters, Molly in particular. I should probably talk about the other stuff involved in this episode. Anyway, the main theme of this episode is more philosophical, discussing the strong versus the weak. This is honestly a theme I really like, especially with the Crawford community. I know there were some people who were disappointed there wasn't a group you could fight against for the final boss, but I actually like this version of Crawford Fallen because they only value physical capability, which results in the lack of conviction to grow. Perhaps the best example of this that doesn't involve Crawford are Clementine and Ben. Clementine at this point has become determined to be useful during the Crawford raid, and while you cannot allow her to take part, she'll be useful either way. However, I think Ben is truly the best when it comes to this theme, especially with the choice to either drop him to his death or pull him up. Ben may be making a selfless act in his mind, but are you really better than Crawford if you do drop him? The end of the episode is great too, with Lee getting bitten and your relationship choices throughout the season being the key to determine who goes with you after Clementine goes missing. It's just a really great way to cap everything off. So do I think this episode is the weakest of the season? No, not at all. I don't think it's better than A New Day to be honest, but this episode is still great in its own right. It's going above Long Road Ahead. This episode is perfect. Yeah, I'm not going to be around the bush here, and I know I'm pretty much going to be sharing a lot of the same opinions as others, but my god, this episode is just so damn good. In fact, it's so good that I'd actually argue it's better than any episode of the TV series. Yeah, it's that good. This episode may be the shortest of the season, but that whole nitpick is pretty much moot when this episode makes the most out of everything. It's just so tightly knit together, hitting you with memorable scene after memorable scene. This is going to make your head spin. Like, where do I even begin? The choice to remove your arm, the bell tower, Ben standing up for himself, the walker fighting the mansion, the attic, Kenny's sacrifice, Lee charging through the horde. Holy crap, this episode is just so insanely good. I also love the stranger and how he pretty much mentions some of the more tougher choices, as if the game is directly asking you how you felt about those choices, how you could justify making those choices. His presence alone is outright unnerving as hell, and the performance from Anthony Lamb is one of the strongest in the entire series. He's without a doubt my favorite Telltale antagonist so far, even more than the St. John's. And do I even need to mention Lee's final moments? Dear Lord, it doesn't matter this scene has made it onto so many saddest moments in gaming history to the extent that some would say it's not sad anymore, it made it on there for a reason. It's just so beautifully handled with some amazing voice acting from Melissa Hutchinson and Dave Fennoy, and it's probably one of the most iconic scenes in any Walking Dead media. This episode is going straight to the top of the list, without a doubt. What an amazing way to cap off the first season. Although, we're not quite done yet. So, this episode is notable because it's the only DLC episode of the entire series. Season 4 was also meant to have a DLC episode where it showed what happened at McCarroll Ranch in more detail, but it was scrapped likely due to either budget or the closure of the studio. Anyway, 400 Days is comprised of 5 short stories with different protagonists that all take place at or near Gil's pit stop, with each taking place at a different point in time. There's Vince's story, which starts the day of the outbreak on a prison bus, Wyatt's story, which has him and a friend trying to escape a dangerous man, Russell's story, which has him being picked up by a dangerous man, and Wyatt's story, Bonnie's story, which has her being followed by a group of flashlight-welded people, and Chel's story, which has her trying to stay safe at the truck stop of a group of survivors. This is all capped off by an epilogue where a woman named Tavia finds the protagonist and offers them to join a community, with your actions throughout their stories influencing their choice. I'll be honest, I'm not that into shell stories. This is the only episode that doesn't have a walker sequence, so that makes it pretty boring for the most part, and the characters are also kind of boring as well. Although I do like we get to see the cancer patients again and find out what happened to Vernon. Bonnie's story I'm also not into, mainly because none of the characters are that likable, although I actually really like the twist at the end where you accidentally kill one of your companions. Russell's story is a step up, mainly because the man who picks him up, Nate, pretty much just steals the show of his delightful yet frighteningly deranged personality. Russell, he's just kinda okay. Wyatt's story is pretty good, mainly because I love the banter between Wyatt and his friend Eddie, and the ending is pretty good as well. Vince's story was without doubt my favorite, however. I know Vince is kinda similar to Lee, but I really like the dynamic between Vince, Danny, and Justin, as well as the irony of the two of them, with Dan committing the more heinous crime but being the nicest prisoner, while Justin is the complete opposite. Additionally, these stories can be played in any order, and stuff actually changes based on the order you play. For example, the Fat Cop here can appear in Bonnie's story if you play Vince's story first, but won't if you play Bonnie's story first. Honestly, it's a bit weird, but I do appreciate that attempt at making choices matter, even if it's pretty convoluted. Regardless, the episode sounds decent, right? Well, unfortunately, this episode has a pretty big disadvantage for one reason. It is entirely skippable. Literally, no choice in this episode really matters in the long run, and aside from Bonnie, who chooses to go with Tavia anyway, the rest of the characters don't even have to go, and if they do go, well, let's just say it still won't matter. Pretty much the only point this episode has is giving a backstory to Bonnie, and let's be honest, did we really need a backstory of Bonnie? I like the idea of the episode, but just the fact it's entirely skippable makes it easily at the bottom of the list. Wow, what an amazing season. I can definitely see why this season won so many awards and propelled Telltale to popularity. These episodes are just so fantastic, and even the weaker ones I wouldn't consider that bad in general. It's full of emotion, great characters, great visuals. It really makes sense for the story to continue with season 2. Does it hold up to season 1? Well, let's find out. So, I went into this episode with really high hopes. A New Day was a great start to Season 1, and I was very curious to see how Season two's opening episode compared to Season 1's. It had some big shoes to fill, but I felt it could pull it off. Well, while I don't hate the episode, I wouldn't exactly call it fantastic either. Start with the positives, I do think there's some potential here. I like the idea of Cloudtide being on her own, separate from Krista and Omi, and learning things the hard way. It's depressing, but I think it's a good way to start the season, and I think Omi and Krista being written off early isn't a bad idea. I think the new characters are decent as well. Not as iconic as season 1's, but then again, those are some big shoes to fill, and I think they're just fine. And characters like Pete and Luke are characters I actually do enjoy. I think the highlight of the episode is how Clementine's loneliness is portrayed. She goes for a lot, and I think it's handled well. And the atmosphere during the episode helps too. It reminds me of the atmospheric horror in Around Every Corner, and I think that's just pretty neat. There's also this scene.
I'm still not bitten.
It's just a great scene. Unfortunately, I think this episode has a few problems. I did say I think this episode had potential, but I think the way I can describe this episode is strangled. This episode wants to do so much, but it doesn't have the time needed to properly play out the scenes it wants to do, and so as a result, the pacing feels all over the place. Like, we barely got to see the relationship between Kristen and Clementine after Omid's death, and then after that, Kristen is almost treated like an afterthought. The sad thing is that if this got maybe an extra hour to flesh out the Krista and Clementine segment and maybe develop the cabin crew members more, then I could definitely see a good episode here. However, even with all that, I think my biggest problem with the episode are the choices. And this is where I might get some controversy, but I think Season two's choices are the weakest of the whole series. It's mainly because the choices made this season either aren't very morally challenging or pretty much result in nothing much changing. Like, you get separated from Krista regardless, the Nick choice isn't challenging, the dog choice has something there, I think, but it's not challenging in the end, the Pete and Nick choice just shot and duck again, and the Dying Man one was so close to being good because it hinted at Krista's fate, but was pointless in the end and never acknowledged after. If the choices were better and the episode was longer, then I could see this episode being among one of the greats. But unfortunately, there's so much working against it that I can't exactly think positively of this episode. It's not a bad episode, but it's certainly disappointing that this started off season 2. Bottom list for season 2 so far, let's just hope it gets better. I vividly remember looking up the spoilers for this episode a lot back in school when it aired, and being so excited to find out who was going to be returning. Yeah, everyone knew it was Kenny, but I was still hoping for someone like Lee, Ben, Carly, Krista, or hell, even Lily. Wistful finger from pre-high school me, but hey, Kenny's still cool. Anyway, this episode. The weird thing about this episode is that the first time I played, I thought it was one of the best episodes of the series. I'm pretty sure a lot of people thought the same way. Upon replaying it, however, I don't think it's as great as I remember. I liked the beginning of the episode, the interaction between either Pete or Nick being pretty good, and I love Carver's introduction. Speaking of which, I think Carver is the highlight of the episode. He's mysterious, but you get enough of a vibe from him that you can tell he's bad news. The other new characters introduced aren't bad either. I like the Lodge group for the little screen time they have, and I kinda wish Walter stuck around longer, solely because it would give Nick something to do, and it would give Serena more of a character other than Kenny's new girlfriend. I also do like the end sequence of the episode where Carver returns with his group to round up the cabin and Lodge survivors. I just think it's a pretty well handled standoff that shows that Kenny is still Kenny, and Carver is an intimidating bad guy. Also, we get Bonnie back, which is cool, I guess? Unfortunately, I think the episode does go downhill once they reach the bridge. I mean, I like the bridge segment. It has one of my favorite walker sequences in any game, despite how improbable some of it is. But I think this quote from Carlos sums up pretty much my biggest problem with the episode.
There's a little house by the bridge.
How big is it?
Nearly everyone in the adult cast grabbed the idiot ball, and Carlos and Nick are noble for this. With Nick, I mean, I could overlook it in his storyline perspective since his idiocy does impact the plot despite how infuriating it is, but Carlos is constantly built up as the smart guy in the group, yet this episode kind of unintentionally shows that he's kind of an idiot. Perhaps the worst example of this is the windmill puzzle where the adults trust Clementine to turn off a windmill they don't know how to operate, yet it's so simple it doesn't even qualify as a puzzle. Honestly, it just kills my suspension of disbelief because why are the adults unable to do a simple task to the extent to get the little girl to do it instead? It just reminds me of those sitcom tropes where the adults are dumb as rocks and the child is the only smart one, and The Walking Dead is not a sitcom. Also, while I love Kenny, I think the episode knows how loved Kenny is, and Kenny pretty much ends up overshadowing the rest of the cast once he returns. Pretty much no one else comes close to him aside from maybe Luke, and even then, Luke disappears near the end of the episode. He's pretty much mentioned once after he just pisses off somewhere. There's also other problems I have, like I think Rebecca's redemption was super rushed and out of nowhere, and that teaching Sarah to shoot choice should have been way more major than it actually wound up being. Also, the decision on whether to stick up for Nick was such a waste of potential for reasons I'll go into. That's all I'm going to say about this episode. It's a sign of things to come. Bottom of the list for now. I've heard a lot of mixed reviews about In Harm's Way, and after replaying it, I can definitely see why. There's some things I like, and some things I don't like. For positives, I actually think it's a really refreshing change of pace to be inside a community, and not only that, as a prisoner. More often than not, one would expect to be able to walk around freely in a community, explore anything like the med pay, food stuff, but not here. It adds to a sort of claustrophobic vibe that I honestly quite enjoy. I also do like the development between Kenny and Clementine here, and the slow pace of this episode actually helps build up some characters like Sarah and Rebecca, both of whom I think really need some development, especially Rebecca. Not only that, this episode actually kind of made me like Bonnie. I actually like this side of her where she has guilds and tries everything in her power to make it up to the group despite her being kind of limited. It's sweet. I actually do also like the Kenny beatdown on the radio and the Walker herd ending I think was super well done, with Carlos being killed, Sarah panicking, and Serena being bitten. Also, I actually didn't have a problem with Alpha not contributing much if he survives the previous episode. I think it makes sense here, the way he goes out is actually pretty sad. As for things I didn't like, well, there's a lot. I did not like how Carver was this episode. In A House Divided, he was this mysterious, intimidating villain who just oozed bad news. And now he's just a kind of cliche dictator villain. He literally does the "we're not so different" shtick. How am I supposed to take him seriously as a unique bad guy if he does that? Especially to an 11-year-old girl. Also, remember in the 400 Days review how I said the other characters joining wouldn't matter? Well, those characters can appear here. In 8-second cameos that do nothing except pad out the episode. However, my biggest problem of the episode was just honestly Nick. It's not that he doesn't do anything bad, it's just that he doesn't do anything. Like, you save him and he's just a background character for the entire episode. Actually, not just that, the remainder of his time alive. It's so disappointing considering Telltale have written great determinant characters such as Carly, Doug, and Ben. Seeing it happen to Nick, a character who had a big role in the previous episode, is just baffling. Regardless, do I hate the episode? No, but I don't love it either. It's probably going to be the episode I'm the most mixed on because it does a lot of things that I like and a lot of things I don't like. It's going above A House Divided, but under all that remains. Not gonna lie, Season 2, not off to a good start. Let's just hope it gets better by the end. So, I remember everyone being hyped up for this episode solely because of this screenshot. It showed off characters like Eddie from 400 Days of all people, and that gave a lot of people hope that maybe the 400 Days characters would play a role in this episode after the disappointing cameos in Harm's Way. Sadly, it didn't happen, of course. Anyway, what do I think about this episode? You know, I don't usually like to talk bad about the game because I do love it, but when they have stinkers like this episode, then it's something I can't ignore. This episode just really shows off why I'm not that big on Season 2 as a whole, and it shows the main problems with it at its worst. For starters, this is an episode where Clementine pretty much has to do everything, which, if you remember, makes me suspend my disbelief that the adult cast survived this long in the apocalypse if a little girl is doing all the grunt work. Not only that, but this is pretty much it at its worst. At least with A House Divided, it was primarily saved to a couple of scenes, and with In Harm's Way, yeah, it had those scenes, but at least it had a point. Here, it's just constant. You gotta help Rebecca through the horror, you gotta get through to Kenny, you gotta find Luke, Sarah, and Nick, you gotta help everyone with prep for the baby, you gotta play the peacemaker between Kenny and Luke. I know Clementine's the protagonist, but there has to be a limit. I also really hate how linear this episode is. In fact, that's probably my biggest problem with the episode. Almost no choice in this episode really matters by the end. It just kills replayability value. And in a game where its main selling point is your actions influence the outcome, that's pretty bad. Hell, the closest I can think of for a choice that matters is choosing whether to save Sarah or not. And even then, she doesn't survive the whole episode regardless. Speaking of which, the determinate character fates are perhaps at its worst here, with the aforementioned Sarah and Nick getting the worst of it. I've said this before, but Telltale have written great determinate plots before, so seeing it done this badly is just shocking. I'm also not a fan of Kenny this episode. His story in this episode just feels like a retread of Katja and Doc, but with a far less interesting character that we haven't really gotten a chance to know. Also, I hated how Luke was portrayed this episode. He's felt ridiculously out of character. Like, he gets Sarah killed because he wanted to plow Jane after their doctor died, which is dumb already, and then he doesn't care he got her killed and that Jane left after? That is not Luke. And no, that scene where he says he's stressed out does not excuse anything because he never brings up Sarah again in the episode. Hell, he doesn't even bring up Nick, his supposed best friend. As for things I liked, I mean, I liked the trailer park location, and Bonnie and Mike were pretty good this episode. Pretty much the only highlight of the episode. The stuff with Jane's tricks was pretty good, and I guess the deck fight was cool. Although, compared to the other fights in this series, I don't think this one compares to others. Yeah, it's going to get the bomb, and honestly, don't be surprised if this episode stays there. I'm actually happy to say that No Going Back is a pretty good finale for Season 2. It's not perfect, but I think the high parts more to make up for the lows. To get the negative stuff out of the way, after 2 episodes of Mike and Bonnie being among the best characters to interact with this season, this episode pretty much undoes this with them betraying the group and leaving with Arvo. Oh yeah, Arvo also appeared in Amid the Ruins, but I didn't bring him up since he's also a part of the choices, don't matter if he got mentioned. And yeah, I don't like Arvo at all. Also, fuck you, Bonnie. That's all I'm gonna say. I actually am more mixed about Luke's death than I really should be. I get why people don't like his death scene, and yeah, I wish he went out better, and I think he should have been the one to face Kenny in the final fight considering the season was kind of building up to this, and Luke was really the only character who could somewhat match Kenny's popularity as the season was progressing. But I actually really like the concept of his death. In fact, I don't think anyone in the Walking Dead media, actually no, any zombie media died by drowning, and I just think it's a super unique death scene. As for the positives, there's actually quite a few. As much as I think it was weird that everyone aside from Luke and Mike got out of the Russian gunfight unscathed, I think the fight itself was good. I do like that Luke finally mentioned Nick, Sarah, and the other cab group members they lost. The stuff at the power station is actually a pretty nice scene that also has some really nice visuals. I actually really like the walk across the ice, and I really like the slow descent to madness from Kenny. I think there's just a good progression here with Kenny's arc that I think is better handled than in Amid the Ruins. And the fight between Kenny and Jane is really well done, and the multiple ending choice is really good as well. Oh yeah, and the dream sequence with Lee is always a highlight, no matter what. However, I think my favorite part of the episode is just the visuals. I really like snow episodes and zombie stuff because it's a very different look compared to usual non-snow locations, and I think snow adds the eeriness of abandoned areas, which The Walking Dead is full of. I know I don't have a lot to say about this episode, but it's just a good episode. Top of the list for season 2 without doubt. I'm just happy the season ended on a positive. Man, it's so disappointing to see that season 2 isn't as good as I remember. It's not a bad season by any means, but it's certainly a very mixed bag. I think the amount of writers per episode didn't help matters. I've heard that some of the writers apparently went on to a different project around the middle of the season, so that would explain how up and down some of the episodes were in quality. Regardless, while the highs of this season are pretty high, the lows of this season are among the lowest of the series. That makes me a bit nervous to revisit season 3, which many fans consider the worst of the series. Before we do that, however, we have to take a small detour. I remember when the series was first announced, people were pissed it was a spin-off and not the long-awaited season 3. Honestly, I wasn't really that fussed because if it was Walking Dead, it's Walking Dead, and I'll play it regardless. That's why I played Survival Instinct even though I knew it didn't have a good reception. Anyway, this episode I think is really brought by the voice acting. I know it's weird to bring up voice acting here considering the series usually has had some really good performances, but this is one of the times where it stands out. Like, I love Sam's voice actress. She just puts in so much effort to make scenes work, and to her credit, they actually kind of do. I think the best way I can describe this episode is that it shouldn't work, but it kind of does. The best example of this is Greg's death. He's pretty much a character we get to know for about 20 or so minutes, but I think the music and Sam's performance here really adds on to it. No joke, I actually got a bit emotional, which is surprising considering I don't feel that way over a lot of games. The characters I did actually kind of like as well. I like Pete's crew, with Oak being my favorite because British, and I think Norma and Randall are interesting as well, although I kind of wish Randall was the main antagonist instead of Norma. Also, the action is really fun as well, and I actually think it's cool they tried out new versions of QuickTime events to spice things up. I think my favorite part of the episode, however, was the locations. Not gonna lie, the locations in this game are my favorite in any of the games. I like Pete's boat, I like the ferry, Monroe, oh my god, I love the Monroe community just from looks alone. I love the whole boat look, and it's just such a unique look that I haven't seen in any Walking Dead media since. I should also talk about Michonne's stars, and I'm personally not the biggest fan of it. Like, I guess the whole central storyline of Michonne, and I know it had Elodie before she debuted in the comics, but more often than not, I'll start to get really invested in the story, and then the hallucinations start up, and I don't know, I guess it's just way too out there for me. Despite that, this episode's just solid all around. It has some stuff I like, and it doesn't do anything really bad. Call me pleasantly surprised. Much like A House Divided, this was an episode I remember really liking the first time around, but upon replaying it, I don't think it's as good as I thought. I wouldn't say it's a bad episode by any means, or even put it on A House Divided's level, but I think its biggest flaw are the hallucinations. More specifically, the flashback sequence. To put things into perspective, we just went through a great escape from Monroe, had a fun climbing segment, met Sam's family and informed that Greg now has a screwdriver for an eye, and then this flashback sequence happens. It just outright murdered the really solid pace it was on, and considering I don't even like the stuff involving her kids in general, that just makes it extra bad. Aside from that, I think the episode is strong. This episode leans way more into the badass Michonne we all know and love, and it's really fun. I already mentioned the escape from Monroe in the tower segment, but we also got the Horde walk, which was fun, save for that random flash of her kids, and stuff after the flashback was fun as well. Like when Randall kills John, it's so sudden and so brutal, and I love it. Speaking of which, I forgot to mention that Jesus Christ, this miniseries is brutal. Like, I know it's Walking Dead, but you can shoot a man in the face with a flare gun and watch see birds and chokes on the inside. I mean, holy crap! That's awesome! Also, I'm so happy Randall was the main villain this episode. He's just such an evil asshole that I can't help but be invested by him. And the interrogation with him is great as well. So yeah, it's got a great start, great end, but a really, really shit middle with a flashback. It's going under in too deep. This episode is, for the most part, just 3 acts. The build up to the Norma confrontation, the confrontation itself, and the escape. And you know what? It may not be much, but what we get is actually pretty well handled. I love the standoff with Norma and the hostage exchange. I know this isn't an entirely new thing. In fact, I think Fear did something like this around the time this episode came out, but I really like it. Also, the invasion of the house was great as well. It was tense, it was wild, it was just really fun, and Norma probably has one of the more brutal deaths in the series. I mean, goddamn. This episode is on a roll full of intensity and it's really good until the hallucinations start during the house fire. I've said it once, I'll say it again. I did not like the hallucinations. It's too out there for me, it takes me out of the immersion, and I just don't care. And the worst part is that the final choice centers around this. No joke, it's one of the worst choices of the entire series. We know those girls aren't real, we know the house is burning down around us, we know we're close to safety, and this game thinks it's a hard choice? Seriously? This episode was so close to being among my favorites of the series because it has a really strong start and middle, but those hallucinations pretty much take it down a few spots. It's not bad, but the hallucinations kinda ruin it. It's going above Give No Shelter, but under in too deep. I have to say, this miniseries surprised me. I may not be a fan of all the flashbacks and hallucinations, especially with the fact the final choice has to deal with those, but aside from that, it's just a really solid miniseries. If the hallucinations weren't there, then I could definitely see some of these episodes being among my favorites of the series. At the end of the day, it's a solid B-tier miniseries. But enough being around the bush. It's time to talk about Season 3. So, this is Season 3, a season which may consider to be the weakest. Well, judging by this episode, I can kinda see where they're coming from. It's not the worst episode in the world, but it's not what I like. I do like the beginning of the episode of Javier's dad turning, and I think the build up to it is great. And I do also like Javier as a character. I know some people were very mixed on Javi being the main character as opposed to Clementine, but I think Javier is a unique enough protagonist on his own that I don't mind it. What I do mind is quite a bit about this episode. I'm going to start with the character design. This season got a design update that I'm not the biggest fan of. Don't get me wrong, some of the models like David, Conrad, and even Beard Javi look good to me, but some others just look off. Perhaps the worst example of this is Clementine herself. I'm sorry, I don't like her look. She just looks like wet clay. I also have a number of problems with the story. I know it's the first episode of Season 3 and it has a bunch of new characters including a protagonist, so it really needs time to develop them, but this episode is just really slow. I know it In Too Deep can also be kinda slow, but at least it had interesting stuff happen during it. Here it's just Javier and the family talking about nothing before plot happens, and even then, the plot I don't really find that interesting. It only really picks up when Mariana gets killed near the end of the episode, and the worst part is that she's the only other character aside from Javier in this episode that I kinda cared about. Oh yeah, I don't care for a lot of the characters this episode. Gabe is kind of annoying this episode, Kate is irresponsible, Trip is Diet Soda Abraham, David fucking infuriates me. And he makes his first appearance by blaming Javi for stuff out of his control. By the way, see that little counter down there? Get ready to see that pop up a lot. And do I even need to mention the flashbacks? I mean, I don't mind the well-intended and low flashbacks. I think they're just fine. Jade's flashback made her to a complete hypocrite. And Kenny's... Oh god, Kenny's. It's one of the most disrespectful ways a character has ever gone out, especially for a character like him. It's probably the worst death in the series, and it's the equivalent of dying on the toilet. Without a doubt, the worst start to a season so far, but I wouldn't say it's on the level of something like Amid the Roads. It's just not good. ties that bind part 2 is thankfully a step up from part 1, but unfortunately it isn't really by much. I like some of the Walker sequences here, like with the tunnel, and I like the raid on Prescott. I actually really like the Mariana burial as well, probably one of the few times I actually felt a bit of sadness in this game. Jesus was also pretty damn cool, probably the highlight of the episode. I guess the flashback was alright, except for one moment which I'll get into, as it showed the dynamic between the Garcia family. I guess Clementine joined the New Frontier was interesting. Yeah, that's about it. I think some of my biggest problems with this episode is maybe the pacing and the ideas it has. At least with something like All That Remains, it has some ideas that I could see potential in. Here, everything is not only kind of rushed, but the ideas are not exactly fantastic. Conrad is honestly the worst part of the episode, I'm sad to say, because Conrad is actually one of the few redeeming characters of this season, but this episode just doesn't work for him. He turns into a poorly rated and rushed version of Season 2 Kenny, especially with the choice involving him and Clementine. I may not be the biggest fan of Season 2 Kenny, but at least his actions made sense of his characterization. Here, he has a gun pointed at Gabe's head, telling his uncle to use Clementine as a bargaining chip to negotiate with the same people who killed Francine, and if you don't decide, he will kill you both. It's a choice that I feel should have worked considering what happens if you do spare him, but let's be honest, who in their right mind would pick Conrad and go along with his ridiculously dumb plan? Speaking of choices, this episode is probably one of the worst when it comes to it. I already mentioned the Conrad choice, but a lot of these choices are just no-brainers. Like, of course I would trust Jesus, of course I'm going to surrender the New Frontier gates. Really, the only choice that doesn't entirely suck is the give yourself up option at Prescott. However, the worst of these is telling off David, which feels like the game is going to jump through all the hoops and pretty much lie to you in order to ensure David looks better. It's so infuriating, without a doubt the worst choice in any of these games. I wouldn't put this episode on the level of Amid the Roads, but it's still pretty close. It's going above part 1. Above the Law exists. Here's the thing, I have played every single one of these episodes multiple times over, and even in preparation for this video, I played them all once more, even the episodes I knew I wasn't big on. I've played Above the Law several times, and I think it's the most painfully mediocre episode in the entire series. I can barely remember much about this episode. Like, I know it starts with some flashback and David returning, and then you get kicked out via shenanigans, and then you find stolen stuff at some warehouse that was stolen by the New Frontier, and then you fight some bad guys, then go back to Joan, confront her before she goes, "Tee-hee, I'm the villain!" and has you eat cake. I know there's other stuff, like with Clementine explaining her past with David, and stuff with Trip thinking about Eleanor, but at the end of the day, I just barely remember it. And speaking of the former, like, what's the point of even taking AJ away from Clementine? It's supposed to be a punishment, but I guess the punishment, AJ now has a group to take care of him? Yeah, Clementine isn't there, but he's getting help, so what's the big deal? If I had a kid who was sick and people with medical supplies offered to take care of him, with the only catch being I can't see him, then yeah, take him, give him all the drugs, just make him healthy. I don't know, this episode is just really forgettable to me, and it's probably the main reason why I don't have that much to say about it. It's just full of nothing moments, and even the most memorable part of the episode, where you get to go all Negan on Badger, is a moment I legit thought happened in a different episode. It doesn't do anything really bad, but it also doesn't do anything really to be that interesting. Top of the list for Season 3 for now, but that's not saying much. Oh boy, thicker than water. It's just... yikes. This is pretty much the episode where I pretty much gave up on really enjoying Season 3. There's just a lot wrong with this episode. I'm going to start with the characters. I said early on that I didn't really care about a lot of the characters, save for a few, as for the most part they range from really forgettable to downright obnoxious, and this episode has them at perhaps their worst. Honestly, you could have a weak plot, you could have some lame choices, but if I don't care about the characters or not like them, then it's dead in the water. This is the episode where David becomes a horrific hypocrite and makes me want to drive my fist through his skull even though the game will punish me. This is the episode where Kara makes the only smart decision this episode and leaves. This is the episode where the game tries to pull the trigger on the Javier and Kate ship, even though Jesus and even Eleanor would be a better option. Speaking of which, Eleanor pretty much destroys her reputation here of screwing over the group, and either getting the underdeveloped Ava or the died soul Abraham Tripp killed here, which is a shame because prior to this episode, Eleanor was one of the few characters I genuinely liked. And spoiler alert, take a wild guess on who gets blamed. Also, Joe pretty much cements herself as the worst of the game villains, even worse than In Harm's Way Carver. She just becomes this mustache-twirling villain, does the whole I can do anything I want shtick, which is honestly even worse than the whole we're not so different thing. And no one in the entire community thinks that's a red flag? Seriously, this community is apparently full of morons, and Joan also has a dumb death scene. Like, Javier apparently has enough time to pull out a gun, say a one-liner, and then shoot her without being shot himself? Really? Oh yeah, I also need to mention Gabe. I know it's no secret that Gabe is one of the most detested characters in this series, and this episode just turns him into one of the most ungrateful little shits I've ever encountered. I swear, when he admitted we shot Conrad just to save him out of pure spite and gave us that smug-ass look, I want to drop kick him down Mount Neeson. And then the game thinks Gabe and Clementine would be cute together? No. Just no. Don't worry, there's 2 far better options in the future that don't involve this little pissant. I also did not like the flashbacks. They just felt like it was a last-ditch effort to have something positive to say about the episode because, hey, at least we got to see Kenny and Jay again after their terrible deaths last time. They didn't even have anything for the Wellington and Alone scenarios. Not only that, but it turns out this episode was rewritten a lot. Like, it would have had moments to make David more tolerable, and have a moment where Javier could speak some Spanish, which would have added more depth to him, and even would have been a former MMA fighter, which is really unique. Oh yeah, and despite playing a big role in the previous episode, Max and Lonnie don't appear. In fact, they just disappear for the rest of the season. Not only that, this episode's just really boring. Like, the whole plot is just really forgettable. Is the game trying to stage a coup, but that's about it. Do I think it's worse than Amid the Ruins? Honestly, no. Because at the very least this episode wasn't linear, but it doesn't change the fact that the characters in this episode were particularly annoying, the plot was boring, the flashback felt like a last-ditch effort to try and save the season, and the rewrites could have made this episode just a little bit better, but regardless, this episode just outright sucks. It's easily at the bottom of Season 3, and my god, it is so close to the throwing Amid Dead Ruins as my least favorite. What a terrible, terrible episode. Let's just hope this season ends on a good note. So, I have to say, going back to this episode, I was really worried, because there were a lot of people who said that From the Gallows was the worst of the entire series. Yeah, even worse than Thicker Than Water and Amid the Ruins. Regardless, I replayed the episode, and I have to say, it's actually pretty decent. Yeah, I like this episode. Maybe it's because I'm so used to the episodes this season ranging from painfully mediocre to just downright bad, but I was pleasantly surprised by this episode. It's not a perfect finale, but I think for what it is, it's actually not bad. To get negative stuff out of the way, I found it really disappointing that some of the characters we saved didn't even make an appearance. Characters like Joan, Clint, Max, and Lonnie I was kind of expecting throughout the episode to show up, but they never did, which is pretty disappointing, especially since I wanted to see a Max redemption arc. I mean, we got to see Rufus of all people come back, why not them? Also, the stuff with Eleanor is really disappointing. Instead of her trying to explain herself and legitimately being sorry she was betrayed by Joan and she in turn betrayed the group, she just plays this season's favorite game of how can we beat Javi today? She doesn't even apologize for everything that happened. And that just made me so disappointed because again, I wanted to like Eleanor, but then, yeah. Also, Ava's other death scene
Holy shit!
is another one of the dumbest death scenes in any of the games. Aside from that though, this episode is kind of cathartic in a weird way. Like, the whole episode is just building up to David's image finally crumbling, and it's so damn satisfying because he's been at the forefront of Javier being treated like trash the whole season, and when he finally loses it, it just puts a smile on my face. That is until he starts beating you, in which case, kick his ass! We're playing a new game! It's called How Fast Can Javier Give You Brain Damage? I'm taking bets on 10 seconds, but considering how you are, Will's willing to go with 5! In all seriousness, I love the Javier and David fight, especially the option where you don't fight him. It's actually really emotional, the acting is superb, the music is great, and the best part is that in both scenarios, Javier actually comes out looking better. Also, Gabe gets hit with a wrench. Speaking of which, I actually didn't want to toss Gabe out a window this episode. He's actually genuinely likable. I didn't feel sad over his possible destiny, but screw it, he was likable for a time. However, the action is just my favorite part. There's some really unique action scenes like with the bulldozer and the broken helicopter, and holy crap, Conrad can live to the end of the series. The only thing that would make this better is if Javier had the option to leave with Jesus and start a new life with him, because fuck the Garcia family, Javi doesn't owe him shit. Yeah, call me crazy, but I actually like this finale. Top of the list for Season 3, and you might be a bit surprised at where it ends up on the final ranking. Yeah, this season was definitely something. Throughout the majority of it, the episodes were either really mediocre or just plain bad, and that will explain why I was a bit more animated when it came to talking about this season. Will I consider it worse than season 2? Yeah. Season 2 at least had some decent characters and some potential. Really, the only characters I ended up caring about by the end of season 3 were Javier, Jesus, Conrad, Maria, and Max. Everyone else was either really boring or just plain annoying, and the ideas it had weren't exactly quality. Regardless, from here we can only go up, and with the final season next, let's really hope it does. Dumb running is good. No, scratch that. Dumb running is really, really good. There's just so much to talk about here, solely because I adore this episode. I'm going to start off the look of the game. This game got another upgrade in the graphics department, and not only does this game look so much better than A New Frontier, but this is probably the best the game has ever looked. Yeah, even more than Season 1. The best way I can describe it is that it has a sort of abandoned but homely look to it that I love. I also really like the new combat here. It's no longer just quick time events, now it's more open, you have to do some strategy, and it's so different yet so easy to pick up. It's a really cool change. The characters are also outright amazing. In fact, I think I love this group more than the Season 1 cast. They're just so interesting to talk to. And the best part is that since Clementine is around their age, it actually makes sense for Clementine to be doing protagonist stuff because they're sort of on her level growth-wise. I also just love interacting with them as well. Lewis is a fun character, Violet is cool as hell, Tennant's a nice kid, Asim is the sanest person in the group, Brody is sympathetic, Rosie is best girl, and even other characters that don't have that much to them come off as just really charming. However, my favorite from this group is without doubt Marlon. Holy crap, I love Marlon. Even though he's technically the villain of the episode, calling him one feels like an over-exaggeration because while he's technically one, he's still sympathetic in a way. He's such an interesting spin on one that I think he may be my favorite antagonist of the whole series, and I kinda wish he stuck around longer. His breakdown in the courtyard alone, I'd argue, is one of the best performances in any Walking Dead media, and we can thank Ray Chase for this amazing performance. Also, can I point out how amazing this voice cast is? I mentioned Ray Chase, but in this cast we get Robbie David, Cherami Lay, John Young Bosch, Sterling Suleiman, Ali Hillis, Keith Silverstein, Alex Fernandez. I mean, dear lord, they went all out for the final season, and all of them put their all into this season, and I love it. Not only that, but I actually like the plot as well. It's just Clementine and AJ arriving at the school and fitting in. It's simple, but I think the characters and the little things keep me from getting bored of it. Also, something I noticed on replay with Rosie is that they actually incorporated the dog from season 2 and had Clementine remember that. This episode has long-term storytelling. That's actually incredible. However, my favorite part about the episode is that the only 2 deaths that happened this episode happened at the end. One common thing I noticed with any Walking Dead media is that the best episodes usually feature character deaths quite a lot throughout the episode. And yeah, like I mentioned, dumb running has them, but it shows that Walking Dead does not need to have a big death scene to be great. It just has to be really interesting, and this episode is just that. I love this episode. It just hits all those buttons for me, and I have nothing bad to say about it. In fact, I actually argue this episode is on the level even better than some of Season 1's best episodes. I can't wait to see how this season turns out and follows up on this banger. Suffer the Children is a very interesting episode to talk about. Not because it's a bad episode, in fact, it's far from it, but it's mainly because around the time this episode came out, Telltale filed for bankruptcy protections and laid off most of its staff, leaving Suffer the Children as the final episode of the entire series before Skybound saved the day. And then ruined it, but that's another story. Anyway, this is another strong episode. Not as good as Done Running, but it's still pretty damn good for what it is. I'm going to start with the elephant in the room, and it's that Lily is back, and to be honest, I'm kind of mixed on it. Like, it's cool seeing Lily again, but I can't help but feel that anyone could have been in Lily's position, even if we never met them before, and I think her monologue was kind of forced. Regardless, still cool to see Lily, and the best part is that it's apparently hinted that she's fighting against New Frontiers, so already I want her to win against them, but that's besides the point. Also, I don't mind that Clementine and AJ were kicked out. I think it's just fair and understandable. It only makes the return when AJ is injured more powerful because it shows that deep down, the Anderson kids still do care. Now for the good parts, and while there isn't as much as done running, there's still a lot to like. For starters, this episode does a lot to develop some of the characters who didn't get that much focus, such as Ruby and especially Mitch. By the way, I love Mitch as well, and maybe some of it is because I'm a Robbie Damon fan, but I just like Mitch as a character. It sucks he ended up dying the way he did. At least he was on good terms with Clementine in the end. Speaking of which, I love how James was introduced during a combat segment. It's such a perfect way for a Whisperer character to be introduced, and he's also just really interesting as well. Him being a pacifist who refuses to kill walkers is a really interesting spin on it, and it's better handled in a TV series with Morgan. Oh yeah, you also have the option to decide who Clementine falls in love with in Louis or Violet. Honestly, they're both just really good choices, and I can definitely see why it's pretty split. I also forgot to mention, anything with the cars just makes me happy because I just enjoy them being regular kids. Something else I actually really like is that you actually have the option to demonize Marlin, and the game doesn't really force you to. Sure, the other characters don't forgive him for his actions, but you have your own say on what to think of him. It sort of reminds me of how you can be very neutral in some of the characters from Season 1, and by extension, it's a nice way to show how much Clementine has learned from Lee. The fight against the Racers was my favorite part of the episode, however. It has sort of the Lord of the Flies feel to it, if that makes any sense, and the one-on-one fight against Abel is one of the best in the series. Solely because he gets absolutely wrecked, and even then, he's still a pretty big threat. It may not be as good as Done Running, but it's still a great episode regardless. Let's just see how Skybound handle the rest of the series. Broken Toys is the first episode produced by Skybound after Telltale shut down, and boy did they come out swinging with this episode. There's just a lot to really take in here. This episode is just holy shit moment after holy shit moment, and while it seems intense, there are enough quiet moments to let the episode breathe, which I'm glad for because I don't think I enjoy a lot of these scenes that much if the episode didn't take a moment to breathe. Speaking of which, this episode has a lot of great moments, like Abel's death scene, Minerva's debut, and especially the lead dream sequence, which is where I really have to praise the graphics. This scene actually looks really dreamlike, and Lee's conversion to the more modern style looks way better than in New Frontier. However, my favorite moment of the episode, and maybe in any Walking Dead media, is Clementine in the barn of the walkers. I know James' whole philosophy on walkers being people is dumb on paper, but the scene is so eerie yet beautiful that it actually made me think about what James says and if he has some sort of point to it. Spoiler alert, he really doesn't. Not only that, but this episode has some more character development for Ten, Ruby, and Willie, which is great. Willie is honestly one of the highlights of this episode, like he does a lot here. Like coming up with the bomb idea, and of course, who can't forget this classic moment?
No.
Chronic masturbation.
Yep, jail time. Oh yeah, I should probably mention Clementine in the jail cell, and it's another great scene. Lily's parable of the twins monologue is great, and the option of Luce's tongue being cut out is a genuine shocker. There's only really two small issues I have, those being the one choice of Dorian cutting off a friend's finger really only has one correct option, and that Larry is kinda demonized here. Like, I'm not a Larry fan by any stretch of the means, but I kinda like the idea of him being a massive jerk, but he's also well-meaning in a way. This episode just kinda turns into a borderline abusive parent, and I just never really vibed with that. Lily's stuff I'm also kind of mixed on solely because of what happens if you don't shoot her. She just kills James because James was really stupid. Thankfully, those problems don't really detract from this episode all that much. It's going under the last one. Let's see how the final season ends. Here we go, the final episode. For Take Us Back, I'm pretty sure everyone was expecting a grand finale on the scale of No Time Left. With an episode with this much hype surrounding it, surviving a studio closure, seeing Clementine evolve from season 1 all the way to now, you have to hope this episode ends on a damn good note. It's alright. Here's the thing, this is not a bad episode by any means, but I can't help but feel a little bit underwhelmed. I think some of it has to do with the short length this episode has. I was getting really used to longer episodes this season, so having Take Us Back be this length was just kind of jarring to me. Granted that No Time Left was also a shorter episode, but No Time Left at least had no moments that are kind of lackluster or just kind of eh. Stuff like the final words to Lily felt really disappointing to be honest, and the stuff with James I'm more mixed on because it just turns James into a massive hypocrite. Also, while I do get the point of the McCarroll Ranch flashback, I can't help but feel this was just kind of padding in a weird way. By the way, I completely missed Eddie actually returning, and when it was revealed that was actually Eddie, I legit scrutinized every little detail of his mom to see if that really was him. Imagine my shock when I realized, holy crap, it actually is. And we offed him. Aside from that, this episode just delivers on a lot. The boat escape I think is a great way to start it off, and being separated from the group is great as well, as it allows Clementine and Asia to process what happened without the others coming in. The bridge segment is fantastic as well, and the fight with Minerva is probably the best in the series. Also, Clementine being bit is a definite shock, even though I'm pretty sure some people saw it coming. My favorite part of the episode, however, is that the final fight of the game isn't against a human, it's against the walkers. I love stories where the final fight is against something that isn't as threatening but you're prepared, but now that Clementine and AG are in a really bad spot, the walkers feel so much more intimidating here, and the music really helps a lot. In fact, I think it's one of my favorite soundtracks in the game. It's got this really intense finality to it, and it fits the scene perfectly. Also, the Clementine fake-out death I think was really well handled. I know some people call it a cop-out, and yeah, it is to an extent, but I think there's enough of an explanation to sort of justify it. Plus, do we really want to have Clementine killed off? Was she just so marketable? Take Us Back isn't a bad episode at all. It caps off the series in a great way, but again, I was a bit disappointed by it. If it were longer and maybe had a few more character interactions, then I'd be more into it. It's going at the bottom of season 4. Man, season 4 was a big step up from the previous 3 seasons. A great cast, breathtaking graphics, a decent story, it's got it all. I think I'll always prefer season 1 solely because it has those more emotional moments that I think season 4 lacks a bit, but season 4 is a really good season regardless, even if I think the ending was a bit underwhelming. This season just reaffirmed my love for not only the series but The Walking Dead as a whole. In the end, I'm just happy The Walking Dead got the ending it deserved. Well, there's only one thing left to do now. It's time to rank the 23 episodes from Telltale's Walking Dead from worst to best. I've thought long and hard about this, and even while writing the script, I changed some of my options on the rankings. But enough talk. It's time to count them down. Amid the ruins, thicker than water, ties that bind part 1, ties that bind part 2, above the law, a house divided, 400 days, in harm's way, all that remains, give no shelter, what we deserve, take us back, in too deep, from the gallows, broken toys, suffer to children, no going back, long road ahead, around every corner, a new day, start for help, done running, and number 1, no time left. Man, I love this series. I don't care if there's a number of bad eggs, I still hold this series very close to my heart. The characters are amazing, the story is great, the choices are impactful, I just love this series so much. Well, that's all for me here. I really hope you enjoyed me going down memory lane and ranking every episode of Telltale's The Walking Dead. Just remember this is my thoughts only, and please say so in the comments section. And don't worry, the next video will be a Hell's Kitchen one, and it's one I've been looking forward to for quite a while. EternalOpossum, out.